So now that we have the basics of R down in terms of how to install it, now we're going to go through just a little bit of the basics of R in terms of just working with it. So when you double click on RStudio, you're going to get a screen that looks very similar to mine. And it has 4 panels on it. The 2 bottom panels are not as important, although they will help us through our different types of analysis. The left bottom part of RStudio here gives us information about our environment. It tells us the values that are stored in variables, different packages we've imported, etc. The bottom right here that you're looking at comprises of a few different things. It has the access to your local file system, an area that can where plots can be drawn. Same for the viewer. Viewer has like a special place to put more advanced type of plotting features. So, and when we get to those more advanced plotting features, you'll see, being able to work in those different areas there. So on the top left part of the panel here is where your open files are. This is where when you open data files or R files, your code or your list of commands are put into this file. And then here is where your console lies. So when it comes to an introduction to R, okay, we can use the same idea of comments. Okay, and as we had explored in Python when we were talking about that, we can type our code on the left-hand side, highlight it, although this time in R, what we do is we press either Control-Enter or you click Run, and that's going to basically send the command over to the console. Now, you can type right into the console itself. That's perfectly acceptable. However, I like writing in here just so that I can go back and change anything and test things more easily without having to recopy commands from what I just worked with. By the way, if you go click in the console, if you press the up and down button, it will explore previous commands that you have typed in. R will also keep a track, a history of exactly what your previous commands looked like. You can export those if you so wish to. So there's a lot of things in R that we can work with. So let's work with some of the basics. So as I've just illustrated in R, we can actually use R as a calculator, standard operating mathematical operations. Slightly different than Python is that it has different ways of expressing these. All of these are basically the same, except a few things. So first of all, unlike Python, R is not going to assume that you want integers. So when you do something like 5 divided by 2, R is pretty good. It will give you back a decimal without having being forced to do 5.0. I don't know if you remember that small little nuance in Python, but we don't need to do that in R. As you can imagine, you can multiply. You can take exponents quite easily by using the caret symbol that shifts 6 over here. Okay, and of course you can do all of this with decimals. 3.3 taken to the 1.2, right? Okay, so there's a lot that you can do with the basic mathematical operations. And by the way, it has the standard remainder function here, which should be 1. Yep. Okay. Okay. So R, put differently, can be used as a calculator. Just like so R can be used as a calculator. Once we've written some stuff down, we can actually save these files, right? Just to keep track. And you can put a .r extension at the end of that. And it should, I don't know if it had saved it here. It might have saved it somewhere else, but that's okay. well, it is what it is. So anyway, we now have a basic introduction to R. Now we have obviously we have a few other things um, to learn about R. It's not just using it as a calculator, just as we had explored in Python. R is actually much more intricate and advanced. So again, we're not just focused on arithmetic. So we might want to use variables. And the way we declare variables in R is not by an equal sign, although you could do that. Technically, what we use is this little arrow. So we use the left pointing arrow, or the less than sign, and a minus sign to create an arrow. And on the right hand side is what we want to put into the variable. So left hand side is variable name, the right hand side is what we intend to put in the variable. So I could put 5, let's say, in the variable x, 2 in the variable y, and then do the standard arithmetic that we might expect with x and y. Okay, we can take x to the y, and a whole bunch of other things that we can do here. So we can run multiple commands by typing them all out first, and then highlighting them and clicking Control Enter. Okay, so lo and behold, we can see that when we go through the standard mathematical operations on the variables, we also see that we get similar type of results than if we were to just plug these straight into R without using variables at all. But variables are very helpful for us because they allow us to store things in R and basically move them around and use them in different areas. So those are the basics of variables. And by the way, variables have the same rules that Python has. You can't use spaces in the names. You can't start a variable with a number. You can use any name you want to. It just needs to abide by certain rules. You can't use certain names. Like, for example, I can't use the variable name 4. Okay. If I do that, you'll notice that I get an error. Okay. So this says a variable. And notice that I'm commenting my code. Comments are used by putting the hashtag. Comments allow us to keep our code nice and organized and clean so that we know exactly what portions of the code do, well, what we were curious about them doing. Okay, so we also can't use if, right? That won't work. We can't use while. That's another one we can't use. We can't do something like this. Okay, that's not going to work either. So again, we can't do something like this, where we use spaces in the variable name. Okay, again, it's going to, R is going to get very confused if you start doing these things. So we can't do those type of operations. By the way, you may come across this from time to time. This is an error. This is a common error that a lot of that new users of R obtain. So if I were to say, let's say 6 times Z, there's nothing wrong with that, except for the fact that I haven't defined Z. So a big part of writing code, especially for data analysis, is the process of debugging. Debugging is the process of finding errors, whether or not those errors are explicit or implicit. Okay, so for example, here are explicit errors. Okay, and as we stated, we get that error. So what is the solution? Okay, what R is basically telling us is that Z does not exist. In other words, we didn't define Z anywhere, and therefore we can't use it. So what's the point here? We need to always define our variables before using them. So here's the fix, right? Set Z equal to any number, 3 or something. Now do the same piece of code that we had here. Now you'll see that the code works. That's because you've now defined the variable Z. You can remove variables, by the way. By using the, I think it's Rn. And now if you were to run that same command, you'll see that you get a problem. So you can remove variables if you want to. It's a good practice for memory management. Although I'm not going to lie, most R programmers, myself included, are embarrassingly pretty sloppy with this. But that's okay, because R has some pretty good memory management, so we don't need to worry too much about this. But anyway, these are the basics of working with the variables. The idea of working with a variable is we always have on the left-hand side a variable name, the assignment operator, which is the left arrow and the minus sign, and the right-hand side, which is whatever it is we're storing in the variables. At last, for this part of the discussion, we also have what are called string literals. And basically, working numbers are not the only things that can be stored in variables. In fact, anything can be stored in a variable. It doesn't need to be numbers. So this is like similar to Python. It's more general than plain old algebra, where when you learned about algebra, the only thing you're allowed to store in variables is a number. Here, you're allowed to store strings, and we define string literals by using the single quotations or the double notation, double quotations. Either way works. You'll notice that you have that working for you. Okay. You can also assign variables to string literals. So you can do something like m is equal to, this is some text, okay? And you can then ask R. By the way, to find out what are in variables, all you need to do is just ask R by typing in the name of the variable. So, for example, if I want to know what's stored in variable m, okay, this is some text. That's what's stored in the variable m. We can also work with the print function, and I'll get into functions. Let me check really quick. Hold on, let me pause the recording. Yeah, so I just double checked, and I'm not going to talk about functions in this video, but short of the fact of just the print function and the rm function. But you can accomplish the same thing by using the print function, where the input can be basically anything that you want it to be, for the most part. You can just print a variable, and R will know how to handle the output for that printing. If you have a lot of information that's stored in a variable, though, that's not always efficient. Anyway, these are the basics of R. So as we can see, similar to Python, we can use R as a calculator with variables included. We can use variables, but we can't use specific types of variables, or variable names, rather. When working with variables, we always use the variable name on the left-hand side and the value on the right-hand side of the assignment operator. we have um, sometimes we get errors, okay? So a lot of the times we have to go through a process of what is known as debugging. This is the process of trying to figure out where our errors stem from, why we're getting them, and fixing them. By the way, debugging is not only restrained to errors, it may be due to incorrect output that we're getting from some test input. And I know in some assignments that I've designed for you, I'm actually going to ask you to debug some code and figure out where the problems are, because that's an important skill that you're going to need to learn when writing code, because sometimes you'll make small mistakes in writing your code, or you didn't think about the solution correctly. And that's going to essentially lead to either error messages or incorrect results with no error messages. You can remove variables if you so wish to, although that's more of a preference and an option, a preference than it is a necessity. You don't need to worry too much about that. And then we've talked about string literals. Put differently, numbers aren't the only things that need to be stored in variables and worked with. We can also store strings, or in other words, pieces of text inside variables.